Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Sunday, January the 9th, and welcome to our video commentary. Today we're going to remember one of the most interesting political personalities of the 20th century, certainly the second half of the 20th century, and I'm talking about former President Richard Nixon. Now, Richard Nixon was born on this day, January the 9th, in 1913. He was born in Yorba Linda, California, in Southern California. He went to college there in Southern California at a small college called Whittier College. Then he went to law school at Duke University in the East Coast. And then he came back. He came back to California and he practiced law in his community of Yorba Linda. In 1946, like a lot of others, he ran for Congress. And by the way, 1946 was one of the most interesting political years of the 20th century from the standpoint of new members going into Congress. You not only had Richard Nixon going in that year, elected as a Republican, you had John Kennedy of Massachusetts elected, you had Gerald Ford of Michigan. That's three future presidents who were elected to Congress that year. You also had Lloyd Bentsen of Texas, who did run for president one time, ran actually for vice president with Michael Dukakis in 1988, and was a senator here in Texas for a long time, and quite a few other politicians who came in 1946 as a new class of members of Congress came in. A lot of them were World War II veterans who got involved in politics in 1946. Richard Nixon was elected to the House in 1946. He was a pretty active member. In 1950, he ran for the U.S. Senate in California, and he won that election. And he was he was known at the time as sort of an anti-communist figure. He was very active in something called the Un-American Committee that was active in the Congress, looking at communists in the federal government and all of that kind of stuff. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was nominated by the Republican Party to be their candidate for president. And Eisenhower surprised everybody, really, by selecting Richard Nixon, the young senator from California. At the time, Richard Nixon was, I believe, 39 years old when he was picked by Dwight Eisenhower. And the Eisenhower-Nixon ticket won a big election in 52. They came back in 56 and won a big re-election that year as well. Then in 1956, Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack, and Richard Nixon got a little taste of being president for a couple of weeks while President Eisenhower was in the hospital. He got back to the vice presidency, and in 1960 ran for president, was defeated by John Kennedy in a very close election, super close election of 1960, controversial election to say the least. Then he went back to California. He tried running for governor, didn't make it. Then he went into the legal profession for a few years and ran again for president in 1968, was elected in 68, reelected in huge numbers in 1972. His presidency was obviously defined to some degree by Watergate because he had to resign because of Watergate, but there were some important achievements of the Nixon administration. For example, a lot of the Great Society programs that President Lyndon Johnson had passed and signed into law were really implemented by President Nixon. He was also instrumental in ending the war in Vietnam. By the end of his first term, the war had pretty much effectively over. He also had some great foreign policy achievements with Russia. He opened up China. He was the first American president ever to travel to China. Unfortunately, he got caught up with Watergate in 1973, 74, and eventually had to resign. So he resigned in disgrace. You cannot eliminate that from his resume, but there were a lot of interesting things on his resume that were very good for the country. One of the great things about Richard Nixon that I would recommend, particularly to young people, is that he wrote a bunch of great books after leaving the presidency. And one of my favorite books that he wrote was the one about his life called Memoirs, a 2-volume book that is fascinating because aside from being a politician, he was a good writer. He was a good writer, and he knew how to explain himself and how to use the right words to do so. President Nixon left the White House in 1974, of course, in disgrace because of Watergate. He lived another 20 years. And during that time, as I said, he wrote a bunch of books and was very influential in advising presidents over foreign policy once he was out of office. He passed away in 1994 in New York. He passed away. His wife, First Lady Mrs. Nixon, had Pat Nixon. Pat Nixon had passed away the year before. And she was a great companion, a wonderful first lady, a woman who we all kind of got to know. One of the things about Richard Nixon is that we grew up with him, because he was obviously in politics when many of us were growing up in the 70s and so on. So we remember today Richard Nixon. I have a post about Richard Nixon on my blog. I also have something today that will appear later on the Babalu blog about Richard Nixon and Cuba, how in April of 1959, then Vice President Richard Nixon met Fidel Castro in Washington, and Vice President Richard Nixon was not very impressed with the future dictator of Cuba. And in fact, he said, this man is either a communist or he's very naive. Well, he turned out to be right about Fidel Castro, as he was about many other things. So we remember Richard Nixon, born on this day in 1913, passed away in 1994. Thank you for watching. And if today is your birthday, happy birthday. Bye-bye, everybody.